So I'll quickly introduce myself as Cathy Bettman, and I'm here because of the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Educators Research Project, which is trying to encourage research and publication in Australia. But I'd just like to give the thumbs up to Metavision Institute, where I'm currently Associate Professor and Deputy Dean of Holistic Counselling and Psychotherapy, but also to Ken Miller and, of course, to PACFA, where Elizabeth and I were on the research committee together. But Elizabeth has a huge history back at PACFA and a huge history, full stop. So I'm going to ask you, Elizabeth, to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. I'm
And
feeling really
welcome.
old with huge history.
No,
Thanks.
I didn't mean it like that.
Nice to be here having a conversation. So, yeah, I'm Elizabeth Day. I'm currentely in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In fact, literally in Kihikihi, where my partner Will and I have a meditation and yoga studio. But I also work full time up in Auckland at the Auckland University of Technology. It's the only university in this country that offers training, a postgraduate training in psychotherapy or any training in psychotherapy.
Wow.
So, I stepped in to the head of department role for the last 3.5 years. Still in recovery from that one. Doing that through COVID wasn't much fun. But there were some lovely things about that role, but it gave me a lot more insight into the scene here in New Zealand. I've been here since 2015, started at the university in 2018. So yeah.
Working in New Zealand and
Mm.
having been in Australia, have there been huge differences that you've both in counseling and psychotherapy and research? Is it very different?
It's one of those things, Cathy. It's like if you go to a country that you know is dramatically different, you sort of expect the differences. When I came here, I assumed there was, like cousins, like there was a sort of similarity but difference. And I guess that's actually what it's been like. Some things feel quite familiar, and then there are quite significant differences in those areas that you're talking about, in other areas too. In fact, as a slight aside, one of the biggest differences I've noticed is in the relationship to the indigenous population here. And so increasingly to get a job at a university in New Zealand, government roles as well, you're really required to have quite a level of understanding of the treaty, Te Tiriti, and some of the language, Te Reo Māori, and an understanding of the history or knowledge of the history, and ongoing commitment to what used to be called biculturalism. The names change as the politics develop, but so that's been a real learning and a good one, and that's ongoing. The university's just finally initiated a whole suite of trainings that we're all expected to do to upskill us in that particular way, so that when we are supervising research, conducting research, among many other of our roles at the university, that we always have in the forefront whenua, tangata whenua, the Maori population, and how they'll be impacted if we're doing any research that impact Maori. Then we obviously need to partner with Maori in that research and so on. So it's a kind of learning in that way that's been quite significant. And then in terms of psychotherapy and counselling, there's a different setup here in terms of the professions. So psychotherapy is a protected term here, like psychology. You can't call yourself a psychotherapist unless you're registered through the board here, Psychotherapy Board of Aotearoa in New Zealand. And counselling chose not to go that route. They were in some sort of joint arrangement for a while, and then when this opportunity came up, so to be government registered, counselling chose to go a different way. And so that has different impacts on how those are practiced and taught and regarded in the profession and in the population. Though I might say, even still, even with its protected status, psychotherapy, still, it's a bit like in Australia. There's a kind of psychotherapy and counselling sit here, psychology and psychiatry and the whole medical model informed professions have more power, more standing, more funding.
But you still said psychotherapy and counseling here. And I was wondering, is it psychotherapy and counseling very separate because of this whole
separate from each other, but closer to each other in relation to the
others?
To the health space, mental health space in New Zealand, yeah.
But in terms of what people call themselves in New Zealand, is that more defined? Like, do some call themselves counselors very particularly and others psychotherapists? Or where do family therapists fit in? How does it all work?
So like clinical psychologists, psychotherapists call themselves psychotherapists, and no one else can call themselves that if they haven't. So if you've got a training in counselling and you do some kind of shorter course in psychotherapy or something, you can't call yourself a psychotherapist. You have to be registered, and to be registered, you have to meet certain standards of training and so on. Yeah. So it's
like at unis when they offer qualifications, tertiary qualifications, so they can't sort of put the two together. So often in Australia, you see masters of psychotherapy and counselling. How does that work?
Oh, so we're a department of psychotherapy and counselling. It started as a department of psychotherapy. I don't remember the history I wasn't around when counselling was brought in, but there's quite a geographical separation as well. So there are 3 campuses of AUT in this country. Currently, they're all up in Auckland. So psychotherapy is taught on the North Shore campus, which is in a more affluent area, and counselling is taught on the South campus in a less affluent area. The counselling team and program tends to be a little bit more integrated into the communities around that campus, and psychotherapy remains a little bit more niche.
Okay, what about placements? Are there certain placements for psychotherapists and certain places for counselors? Wow.
Right.
So there's a very definite division.
Yeah. There's same old headaches that you have, in Australia as well around finding quality placements. But yeah. Counselling students can get placements in schools amongst other things. There are some crossovers. But and the health sector here is going through significant structural change. But there were certainly placements in what were called the DHBs, the district health boards, for psychotherapists, but I don't think counsellors had places there. Okay. It was harder to get them, but it's not easy for psychotherapists to get or trainees to get placements in public health so much either.
Okay. And you know how in Australia we have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander healing practices as very distinct and understandably. Do you have a similar separation or in New Zealand?
It's a big, important discussion going on at the moment. So there's been, for a long time, before I arrived as well, there's been, critiques, valid critiques that it's a Eurocentric profession and training, psychotherapy, and efforts to challenge that in different ways. So I'm currently involved in a research project with 2 Maori colleagues and a Pakeha colleague, so a European New Zealander colleague, looking at decolonizing the curriculum.
Wow.
Obviously something that we're just getting a conversation in process. There are other conversations around that as well in process. So so we did a piece of research looking at Te Reo Māori, so Maori language concepts and terms, Maori worldview concepts and terms that may cross over with some of the concepts and terms in psychotherapy. Just looking at what they might be, notions of being, notions of selfhood, agency, and so on, and how and when and where there may be some sort of crossovers, so that we can start to or continue to inform our curriculum to be more integrative in that way. There are, of course, arguments for having a a Maori-centered and run psychotherapy program, but they probably wouldn't call it psychotherapy, though there is an association of Maori psychotherapists, waka oranga. So, and that's their call, and I don't know what the current thinking is in waka oranga about developing a Maori specific program, but there is certainly interest in making the existing program more integrative. But yeah, the predominant demographic of lecturers in the department is not Maori, though we have had significant Maori colleagues coming and going over the years, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. And so that's left a really good imprint into the program. And most of the non-Maori lecturers are also learning and have, to different degrees and capacities, bring in Te Ao Māori worldview into the program. We start our classes with what's called a karakia. Like at events in Australia, certain public events, you start with either acknowledgement of country or welcome to country, depending on whether you have Aboriginal representation there. So it's not that, it's different, but it's related in a way. So Maori will start most gatherings and meetings with one another with a prayer or an invocation in some way. And so we start our classes with that, finish our classes with that. There was a drive to make sure we used at least 50% of our reference lists referenced Maori authors.
Really?
Yeah, just various steps. A lot of that is in place, but there's obviously a long way to go. So,
and the research you're doing on that, is that a formal piece of research, or you're just investigating together?
Well, we got some funding to do. We had mentored a student through producing a lit review to start that. So a scoping lit review. We'll build on that work. We'll then do some curriculum redevelopment work. And the next phase is to interview past Maori students and staff around what supported and what constrained their time at AUT in our department, so that we can target both recruitment for students and also staff, Maori staff.
So it's a huge project.
Yeah, it'll roll on, and I'm sure then there'll be more offshoots from it that we'll be doing.
Well, there always is, isn't there, with research? You start finding out the questions that need to be asked as well.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly.
So how did you get interested in doing research?
That's an interesting question, really. Oh, someone's just mowing the lawn. I don't know if you can hear that.
I can't.
Life is buzzing around me at the moment. I guess so. I trained in the arts, in the humanities, when I was an undergraduate student, and then and I loved it. I also studied law for a while. Did not love that, so I really focused in on the humanities. And it was at a time in Melbourne where postmodern theories were really spreading through departments in the humanities, and very engaging for me as someone who really wanted to understand the world, how systems worked. And I was in literature and cultural studies, predominantly, also fine arts, and studied film as well. And I just found I was very interested in a history of intellectual thought. What do we know? How do we know it? Why do we know it? What do we think about it now? How is knowledge generated? That was all interesting to me, because that underlay my understanding of culture as well, and structures of power, and how certain voices, get heard, some don't, why, how that all works. So I was just very engaged in all of that, and found myself really stumbling into a PhD. I stumbled into a master's because I wasn't finished with study. I'd done an honours degree and had some questions I was interested in, and started a master's. And then back then, a master's by research was often converted into a PhD, and that was the recommendation. So now I'm doing this PhD. This is last century, by the way.
Not quite.
It was. It started in the 90s, last century, very definitely.
Oh, true.
And so I ended up doing a Foucauldian, Butlerian critical discourse analysis of subject formation and expression and identity politics, in a way, a critique of identity politics. And so it was interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, the approach. And to cut a long story short, I brought in discourses around legal discourses, medical discourses, and literary discourses to look at how the subject is understood and formed, the sense of selfhood is conferred in certain cultural contexts, and what that meant. I don't know if this is making sense, but this is why I got interested in research. So I found that Virginia Woolf's Orlando, that was part of what I looked at, that Orlando, a biography, offered a really radical literary aesthetic for intersubjective relating. That's what I found. And it subtly produced a really compelling and intelligible character in Orlando, who was actually not fixed in the sex and gender binary system. A very subtle, innovative literary aesthetic. Revisionists are looking at Woolf through a different lens, and there are some problematics around her, various entitlements and so on, which is good for another conversation. But in terms of this literary aesthetic, very, very important. And she marshals desire and empathy, what she called ecstasy and understanding in the text, and present moment awareness. And she marshals all of that into the art of intersubjectivity. And this really excited me. It's been an enabling aesthetic for thinkers in the field of gender and sexuality and identity. And of course, Orlando's having another moment with that recent film, Orlando, My Political Biography. So we, especially at this kind of complex time in kind of the discursive realm, in the lived realm of gender fluidity and other complexities, we tend to reach for the artifacts of the humanities, I think, as Freud did, of course, to help bring forward into discourse the unknown knowns. And so that process, it was really, and I wasn't thinking about career at that time when I started in my 20s. I was just interested in the ideas. My own subjective condition as a queer person as well, and my training in intellectual inquiry through literature, through cultural theory, all of that propelled me into this sort of sustained inquiry into the grounds and the conditions that give rise to subjectivities, to subjective agency. So in a broad sense, research just felt like a natural part of my personal and my university life. And, study in the humanities in particular, I think, trains you in the art of disciplined thought and inquiry. And the world was there to be understood. So I just went on from there. Was very much about working in, through, and with the world as I saw it. And I love study and I love inquiry. Yeah.
So what happened then? Because I mean, that sounds such a passion, such an interest, such a deep experience, that when that was finished, what then?
What?
It sounds like a bit of what do you do next?
I went to a Buddhist monastery and ordained is what I did next.
But did that have an impact on you? Did that kind of lead to your next phase in the
The
Buddhist
research,
monastery? Yeah,
the
that
research.
particular bit of research.
Directly, it did directly. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's pretty powerful. I mean, that was life-changing personally, as well as what you were disseminating.
Yeah, yeah. It was really transformative. You're right. It was absorbing, it was exciting. It wasn't practical. It took me a long time to do this, to complete it. And I wasn't that, I was at a time, it was late 20th century, and more people were studying full time in their 20s, doing PhDs. Well, actually fewer people were doing PhDs, but it was starting to become difficult to sustain, in terms of resources for people. But that was kind of the tail end of an age where you could spend quite a lot of time in an inquiry like that. And so, yeah, it was very transformative. It brought me in touch with the next phase of my life, really, that inquiry into consciousness and intersubjectivity. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So I did some practice, through meditation and my intensive time in a Buddhist monastery practicing, cultivating consciousness, cultivating the mind, in a slightly different way than research does, but as a lead on from that. And then when I came back and I'd had some training in psychotherapy, then I had some more training in psychotherapy. In
That was
fact,
when you left the monastery?
yeah, in before and after. In fact, being in a monastery it was really clear to me that actually supporting people to work through trauma and difficulty is a really important prelude before people can really cultivate the mind in other ways. So that became quite clear to me, just from seeing people come and go. And, it's a kind of challenging life, that life. So,
It sounds like there's a book in that one anyway. At
oh, we can talk
least.
about that later, maybe, maybe. And there were such fascinating people there in the monastery, and the women monastics. I think the men got involved as well in their own ways, but were very active around psychotherapeutic inquiry as well. And lots of people come to monasteries willing to offer their expertise in support of people who are living in that way. So, or they come because they want to be taught how to meditate, which is what happens at monasteries, and among other things. And then they want to give back. So there was a flow of different expertise. I was over in Europe, and there was in the UK, and so that was always present in the field of our practice as well. It wasn't about just. It certainly was not about bypassing the world. It was about coming into presence with what's there, and processing and various other things. So psychotherapeutic engagement was also present. So yeah, when I left, I focused on that more. And the idea of coming back into a role as a literary academic just didn't quite have the same appeal anymore.
So what
I wanted,
happened then? You got
well, then
yourself more heavily involved in psychotherapy.
that's right. Then I was practicing clinically, and I did get back into higher education to teach, and sort of picked up an academic role within psychotherapy and counselling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in your academic role, how involved were you in research? I mean, eventually you landed up chairing the research committee of PACFA, which is the associate, well, one of two associations, but you chaired that, you were on the board. So how did it get to that?
Yeah, it's the only association for psychotherapy, PACFA actually, but yeah,
Yeah.
there are two associations. Well, I think, as you know, in our fields of psychotherapy and counselling, the number of people with PhDs is vanishingly small, and so it's growing, and that's part of the work of PACFA and the research committee, isn't it, to support that development and growth. So yeah, well, I had an academic role, and I was lecturing and designing curriculum and conducting some research. And yeah, through people that I knew, got invited to be on that committee, chaired that committee. I'd chaired curriculum committees and other committees. So it was, in a way, a continuity. It felt like a continuity of the work I'd been doing in a way. And that committee has been quite a powerhouse. It's done a lot of work over the years. When I arrived, I was so impressed by what they'd managed to achieve, and they'd just started the establishment of PACJA, the first psychotherapy and counselling journal in the country. And it's been going for, I think, about 12 years now.
And you've got quite a few publications in PACJA. I happened to have a look the other day.
Did you? Have I? I've got a few. I think we might need to declare it's double-blind peer-reviewed, so it's not like we.
Yeah, no, of course, absolutely. I just took that for granted. Absolutely. Yeah, that was me congratulating you for having got through peer-reviewed stuff to be in the journal.
Yeah, no. Well, we did always wonder about that when we were on the research committee submitting publications to our own journal. But that's what I love about the peer review process, double-blind peer review process. It's a really important part of the credibility of research. It's the difference between research and opinion, really, isn't it? There's research that goes through that process.
Yeah. And of course, the other important contribution to, of course, PACJA, of course, things like surveys, analyzing data from those, but also the conference and the involvement in that. what are your thoughts on conferences and all the importance of them and how it encourages research publication? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, conferences, as they have been called, they tend to, they bring us all together, don't they? Or they can bring cohorts of practitioners and researchers together to share ideas. So it's a kind of community, a meeting place, a temporary community or meeting place. The last one that PACFA organised of its biennial conferences was a festival of ideas with much more indigenous input to the structure and the content. And we were both at that. I think we held a day, didn't we? Or one of the research days, our members of our committee did. And, like anything, they have their great strengths, they have their limitations, but I think they're an important part of the ecosystem of research, certainly research and the world of research, but also in our profession, clinicians. So, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see PACFA organising more conferences or festivals of ideas. There's probably newer ways and of encouraging access and different ways to present, different ways to link, different ways to generate ideas. But I think that there's a real place for them, really important, and for journals, academic journals that are peer reviewed.
I think that's why Festival of Ideas is more exciting. Conference sounds so much steeped in just the old, which I'm not saying is always bad. It's good to get from that, but Festival Ideas sounds creative and innovative and energizing.
It's not old-fashioned, is it, like conferences? So.
No. But what I'm interested in is, I always used to think it was so sad that teaching research at unis in Australia was never considered doing research yourself. It was just teaching, and it took up a lot of time and a lot of energy, and it was beautiful to do. But that didn't help people in their research, their own research and CV potentials, could I say. And what's sad to me now too is that it seems that that's being diminished in Australia even more because of how labor intensive it is for lecturers to be doing supervision of masters research projects, and the requirement for so much other psychotherapy or counselling training that it's kind of being pushed out of master's degrees. Is that similar in New Zealand? And what's your view on that? How should we be thinking of providing foundations so that students can go further with research?
So there's a lot in that. I mean, the first thing I think of is when you talk about teaching research as teaching, that's the case as well. And at AUT, when we had a, what did they call it? Financial recovery plan, a massive round of redundancies. There was a document put out sort of retrospectively of what's expected of lecturers at different levels, the outputs that hadn't been part of any position descriptions, and what sat in what particular areas. So the three main areas at universities: research, teaching, and what they call academic citizenship. And research supervision sat within teaching, and there was a lot of complaint about that. But so there's teaching research in a classroom situation, and then there's supervision, and I think those are a little bit different actually, but nevertheless they're both regarded as teaching. And so the expectation is that the research outputs come when you publish with your students, with your PhD students and master's students. So we've put a lot of effort, and I've really been encouraging that over the last few years at AUT, that effort into supporting lecturers to publish with their students, to support students to get their material out there, but also to kind of what's the word, to reinvest some of the work that's gone into that into outputs that they're required to have. So that's one area. It's really difficult in a master's program. So the psychotherapy program at AUT is a master's program. It's actually 3 years. There's a graduate diploma that's a required prerequisite, and then officially 2 years full-time of a master's that usually goes into a third year for the completion of a dissertation. But, you know, back in the 80s and 90s when I was at university in Melbourne, um, the pathway was undergraduate degree 3 year for not for psychotherapy. It didn't exist in a university setting, but an undergraduate degree, honours degree, master's 2 years by research, PhD. That's all changed dramatically. And now we have these professional master's programs. And so some of the expectations of what constitutes a master's have had to shift because a clinical training has a lot of content in it, doesn't it? And then there's the training to do research and to produce research. And a lot of students who come into a clinical training often aren't that interested in research.
Exactly. And
And
it's
so,
only when they do it that they then think, hey, this isn't so bad. I quite like that. So if it isn't in the clinical masters, then you wonder how many would be enticed to be doing research.
look, exactly. So we also built in, I've just had to let my cat in and I'm
Yeah,
on
I'm looking where my dog is.
it's the time of the animals, time of day. Um, yeah, we revised what was in the graduate diploma. We sort of went back to develop a fresh scaffolding so that students were taught research in that first year, in the second year, and in the third year, so that by the time they were doing their dissertation, they'd had a few years of teaching of research, so that they could manage a dissertation. And then it's quite difficult to entice them into a PhD. So I from day one, when I meet the students, I start talking about a PhD and about the importance of research for building a profession and how ours is an emerging profession, and do a little bit of contextualizing about where psychotherapy sits in the ecosystem of health. And they can be quite surprised that it's really a small player at this point. So they get the picture of what's needed, and then it's up to them, I suppose, their individual capacities and interests.
Mm.
We do have a program here. I wonder if you have something similar, perhaps in some of the universities in Aussie as well, but um, a doctorate of health sciences is offered in our school. I was just, as a brief tangent, I was going to say also that I find that the kind of research that you do and the research that's possible as an academic in a clinical program depends on where you're placed in the university structures, right? So counselling, there's often more counselling than psychotherapy at universities. And from memory in Aussie, often placed in alongside education or psychology or
Social work.
science, social work. Yeah, yeah. Often these kind of slightly uncomfortable alliances. For us, we moved when I stepped into the head of department role, we'd moved into a new school. We were moved into a new school from public health. We were moved into clinical sciences. So very with 9 other departments that were, nursing and physiotherapy and OT and so on, dental health, that were all very much based on the positivist approach. So another slightly uncomfortable alliance there. But I mean, we have great colleagues, but just in terms of the underlying assumptions, it's very scientifically oriented, and I see psychotherapy as much more humanities oriented.
Mm.
And so this program that's offered, the Doctorate of Health Sciences, is offered in the School of Clinical Sciences precisely for to attract practitioners who have quite a bit of experience in the field, and want to come back and do some kind of, have some question they want to explore, and develop in some way with some discipline around it. And so they can do the first three, they call them papers here. I think they're still called units or courses in Australia. So the first three units, let's call them, are taught courses. So they'll learn how to deepen their understanding, refresh, renew, on how to conduct a lit review, how to work with specific methodologies and methods. And across 9 months and across those 3 units, they develop a 10,000 word research proposal. And that forms a presentation that's assessed by 2 reviewers who haven't been involved, not the supervisors, 2 reviewers. And from there, the student's candidature is either confirmed or not yet confirmed while they revise their proposal. And then they apply for ethics approval, because it's almost always human research. And they take the next 2 years to complete it. And it is required to be relevant to the profession. And what's really good about it, it's a great pathway for psychotherapists and counselors who've been working clinically for years to generate some applicable research and you know, that has rigor behind it and discipline. Yeah. So I'd actually invite any Australian clinicians who would want to do this to consider applying if there aren't
Oh,
any.
really? And they happy to take Australian citizens into the research?
Aren't universities
I
happy
think
to
so, but I just, when you
money?
said that, I went, oh, it just went, whoa, I didn't even think about that. Wow. Wow. I think actually that's a problem that in Australia we kind of cut ourselves off a little bit and
Yeah.
look very like parochially at stuff. You know, like I just went, whoa, and I thought about that.
Well, I mean, there might be equivalent clinical programs.
Yeah.
There wasn't when I was working at in Australia. There wasn't at the
Yeah.
institute I was at, but there may be. But these are different ways of stepping clinicians back into research in a way that's not the same as just you know put a halt on your work and or work part-time and you know write a PhD across 3 to 6 years. It can be quite isolating for some people. It's very
Yeah.
exciting for others.
Yeah.
So I think it's a fantastic solution in some ways. Having said that, I've got students who are doing PhDs and absolutely loving it. They've come in thinking I'm more a clinician, I'm not, not an academic. But I do have this burning question and, want to get some training. And what I find is that they really build a kind of um, they learn that they don't have to be an academic, a full-time academic to do research for one thing. But they recognize that the disciplined approach of research or as a research project brings shape and quality to any inquiry. I found them growing in confidence as they complete the research, and it gives them standing to lead conversations in the area of their research, with fellow practitioners. And so it breaks down some of those binaries around clinical versus academic as well, because I think I noticed it in Australia and I certainly notice it here. There's um, if not an outright hostility, though that is sometimes the case, there's a kind of resistance to research among clinicians.
Mm, mm.
And
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking when you were saying that because there has been such resistance and because it's been viewed as such an isolating and what was I going to say? Can't quite think of the word. There are so few PhDs in counseling and psychotherapy that there are some departments that are no longer taking PhD students because they don't have any counseling PhDs or psychotherapy PhDs or even related PhDs. It's just such a dearth of them that these opportunities are getting smaller.
that's alarming, isn't it? Yeah, it's we all need to do more work on this if we care about it. But I mean, to be quite direct about it, this hostility to intellectual inquiry, I think there's something almost cult-like sometimes in the profession, where experience is privileged at the expense of intellectual research-based inquiry, as though they're mutually exclusive, and they're absolutely not. It's a shame, an unnecessary shame, really. All the academics in my department are also experienced clinicians. So I think we need to dissolve some of the binary thinking around that. When I talked about cult-like, I mean, um, the program that we teach is psychodynamic psychotherapy, and there's been such a strong allegiance to Freud for such a long time, and that's shifting now. But it wasn't unusual maybe 15 years ago for people to be talking as though Freud is unchallenged and uncontested and just reaching back to seminal thinkers as though there hasn't been a massive range of conversations going on since that's dramatically changed how those ideas are received. So, research brings fresh air into and builds professions for those reasons, I think. So, one of the challenges, I think, is that the students entering training, certainly in psychotherapy, are generally already in their mid to late 30s. Average age is late 40s in our program. So by the time they've completed their arduous training, they're less focused on doing more intensive research. They want to earn some money. They want to put their training into practice. You know, that's why I think the Doctorate of Health Sciences is one handy sort of solution to get
Wow.
some excitement.
Mm.
So we reach out a bit more proactively now. We sometimes look at, you know, the last 5 years and students and who's done well and who seemed to be interested in ideas in a particular way, and we get in touch with them and invite them to come and do some guest lecturing and to consider doing some research or some co-authoring.
Mm.
You know, just trying to tell the story a little bit more excitingly, I
Mm.
think, as well, to
Mm.
build that interest. Because it's a lot. It takes a lot of your life to commit to a PhD or a doctorate.
It absolutely does. And people don't sometimes understand how much time it takes and how much actual bum on seat it takes to do it. But
That's right.
why I'm very mindful of the time, and you've given so much time already. But so, what would you say to students? What's great about doing research from your point of view?
I mean, life's too short to do something you don't love. I think there's got to be some love and interest in it. Um, but there's something about learning a set of skills and practices that are very transferable, actually, as a way to deepen understanding and bring it forward and share it. Cat's coming in again. In going out. So I would say I'd like to see more interest from our students and from professionals in the social determinants of health, in issues of inequity, power structures. Those things haven't gone away, but you know, our climate emergency. I'd like to support more inquiry in these directions to ensure that psychotherapy practice actually remains relevant, remains impactful, and that it's understood by those who are seeking therapy, who don't easily differentiate between psychotherapy and counselling and psychiatry and so on. I think we've got to tell the story better, so you can contribute to that. One of the challenges there is that the nature of research, of training, is to encourage self-inquiry for sure. And this develops good clinicians, but it can mean that most students write their dissertations about themselves. And, you know, autoethnographic and heuristic research methods can produce fabulous depth research in a smaller, but in a smaller dissertation, I think it can lead to a lack of broader relevance. So when you feel that your research is relevant, when you can publish your research, start a conversation or join a conversation and generate elements of change in practice or policy, I think seeing impact is actually really important for people as well. So we need to show that more. And something I've noticed in academic contexts, in clinical trainings, is there's not a lot of research from the lecturers that goes back into the teaching. The content isn't really directed by active current research. And I think that's another way that you show the relevance of research, the importance of it, and the impact of it. So showing it, producing current research, encouraging the reading of current research. Some reading lists have some pretty dated material on them in counselling and psychotherapy programs. So if we're not actively engaging in it, how will our students actively engage?
Wow, that's making me think of a lot of things. Was there anything I should have asked that I haven't asked that you want to put in here?
Mm. I don't think so. It's been a lovely conversation. We're in a really changing world, and I think we've got to keep up in our programs to keep our students engaged. And I do see that as it's difficult in really content heavy training programs. And I think that's an area where we all need to put a bit of attention, and that will spark interest. But no, there's no other lines of inquiry. Oh, maybe there's one thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I when I first came, when I was first teaching at AUT, my first role there, and going to oral defences for PhDs. That was a new thing for me. I know it's an old part of the old English system, and it occurred in Australia as well. But when I finished my PhD, I didn't have to defend it orally at a viva. And so I thought, oh, it's a bit old-fashioned here at these vivas. And my first student, she sits there for three hours with a couple of examiners and the supervisors and a chair. And really, I could really see the power and effectiveness of that. It's kind of an initiation into being a fully fledged researcher. It requires a student to defend well, to really own their research and their role. And I could see that as a transition process, an initiation process that was missing in my era of students at uni. So I believe it might be coming back in some universities in Australia too.
Well, I can say that I love the opportunity of being part of that one that I did with you and Dennis O'Hara. And I totally agree. I think it gives it another level. I think it's advantageous to everybody who's involved in it. It just rounds it off. It's a great learning experience for everybody.
Yeah, yep. And it really grew on me. I'm just letting the cat out.
What is it? This is another cat situation. It seems to be very much in our time at the moment where people are talking about cats.
He wants me to give her some food. We come back to the basics, and I will give her.
Mine are like that as well. But
yeah, I think that's, if you can articulate at depth your own work and withstand some challenges and so on, I think it's a really purposeful and formative practice. And so sometimes we don't know what we've lost till it's gone. Sounds like it might be a good song, or got till it's gone. But some of these processes and procedures really help to locate people in their research pathway. And anyone I know who's gone through it has really enjoyed that. So we just need to keep thinking about what works and what doesn't, and how to value the research that people do.
Yeah.
And the whole explosion of fake news and what's happened there, and the challenges it brings to democracy. It really gets me quite excited about how we need to preserve a culture of research.
I'll leave it on those words. I agree completely. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the recording now.